Picture this, a golden throne, perhaps, crafted with the finest jewels and shimmering under the weight of countless generations. Yet, upon it sits not a paragon of virtue, but a soul consumed by shadows. Its whims reshaping empires and shattering lives with a single, unhinged decree. What unseen torment lurks within the hearts of those anointed by fate with absolute dominion? How does the boundless expanse of power contort the human spirit, transforming leaders into living nightmares? From the marble corridors of ancient Rome, where an emperor serenaded the city's demise with a lyre, to the windswept steppes where a conqueror weaponized plague-infested corpses. History whispers tales of monarchs whose eccentricities transcended mere oddity, bleeding into the grotesque and the tyrannical. Imagine a king who believed himself made of glass, or another who conversed with severed heads, seeking counsel from the mummified remains of his enemies. These are not fables of fiction, but the chilling realities of reigns that defied sanity, where the private obsessions of a single individual held nations captive. Tonight, we delve beyond the gilded facades and monumental legacies, stripping away the layers of myth to expose the raw, psychological horror that festered beneath the crowns of 15 of history's most bizarre rulers. This is not merely a recounting of forgotten atrocities, but a profound exploration into the corrupting acid of unchecked authority, revealing how human frailties, amplified by boundless power, can erode the very essence of humanity. Prepare to witness the terrifying truth that the line between ruler and monster is often etched in the fleeting sand of circumstance, easily erased by the relentless winds of ambition and absolute control. Oh, in the gilded age of emperors and kings, a peculiar shadow often fell across the opulent halls of power. It wasn't the shadow of war or famine, but something far more insidious, the creeping darkness of the human psyche, warped and magnified by absolute dominion. This is not merely a tale of eccentric rulers, but an intimate look into the very heart of corruption, where the ordinary became bizarre, and the bizarre morphed into the monstrous. We begin our journey in a time when the world was vast and empires stretched like colossal titans across the known lands, their destinies often tethered to the fragile mental state of a single individual. Peace, if it existed, was often a fleeting illusion, easily shattered by a sovereign's whim. Consider Nero, born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus in 37 AD, whose early life offered little hint of the grotesque spectacles to come. Adopted by Emperor Claudius and renamed Nero Claudius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, he inherited a world of unparalleled power. Rome, the eternal city, was a sprawling metropolis, a beacon of civilization and engineering marvels. Its citizens, a bustling tapestry of senators, plebeians, and slaves, lived under the shadow of the imperial court, their lives intricately woven into the fabric of their ruler's temperament. Young Nero, a prince among princes, harbored a fervent, almost desperate passion for the arts, for poetry, for music, for the grand theatrics that defined Roman entertainment. He envisioned himself not merely as an emperor, but as the greatest artist history would ever know. This ambition, burning with an unnatural intensity, seemed innocent enough in its nascent stages, a youthful aspiration. Yet, beneath the veneer of artistic sensitivity lay a nascent megalomania, a yearning for applause so profound it would eventually demand the very city as its stage, its populace as a captive audience to his macabre performances. The seeds of destruction were sown not in malice, but in an insatiable, narcissistic hunger for artistic validation. An early sign that for Nero, reality would always be secondary to his personal drama. Centuries later, the young Elagabalus entered the stage of Roman power in 218 AD, a stark contrast to Nero's calculated artistry, yet equally unsettling. Born Varius Avitus Baesianus. This emperor ascended the throne at the tender age of 14, a pawn in his grandmother's shrewd political game. His background was steeped in the exotic mysticism of Emesa, Syria, where he served as a priest of the sun god Elagabal. Rome, by this time, was a weary empire, its glory often overshadowed by political intrigue and military instability. Its jaded elite had witnessed every conceivable excess, yet nothing could prepare them for the boy emperor from the east. Elagabalus brought with him not an artistic temperament, but a fervent, almost unhinged religious zeal. He was deeply devout, yes, but his devotion was fused with an insatiable curiosity for sexual experimentation and gender fluidity that shattered the rigid social codes of Rome. His early acts were marked by an almost childlike disregard for tradition, viewing the vast Roman pantheon as secondary to his foreign sun god. There was a raw, unbridled energy about him, a sense that he was not merely ruling, but performing his faith, utterly convinced of his divine connection. The air of the imperial palace, usually thick with political whispers, now carried the faint, unsettling scent of exotic incense and the hushed murmurs of scandal. A quiet tension began to build, a premonition that this reign, unlike any before it, would redefine the boundaries of acceptable imperial conduct. And then there was Caligula, Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, born in 12 AD, whose very nickname, Little Boot, hinted at an innocent childhood spent among his father's legions. When he ascended to power in 37 AD, Rome breathed a collective sigh of relief. The paranoid and reclusive reign of Tiberius had cast a long, oppressive shadow, and Caligula, initially, seemed to embody the promise of a golden age. He was young, charismatic, and began his rule by restoring democratic elections, freeing political prisoners, and showering the Praetorian Guard with generous bonuses. The city rejoiced, convinced that a benevolent and enlightened leader had finally arrived. This was a Rome that desperately craved stability, a return to the perceived virtues of its golden past. The initial days of his reign were marked by a refreshing openness, a stark contrast to the preceding tyranny. He was seen mingling with the people, attending public games, and showing genuine interest in the welfare of the empire. But even in these halcyon days, an astute observer might have caught fleeting glimpses of an underlying instability, a theatrical flair that bordered on the obsessive. His charm, while undeniable, carried an edge of unpredictable intensity, the whispers of his past, tales of a childhood marred by the poisoning of his family, were easily dismissed amid the general euphoria. Yet, for all the initial promise, the seeds of his eventual madness lay dormant, waiting for the opportune moment to sprout, threatening to plunge Rome from relief back into an even deeper, more terrifying abyss. The benign veneer of youthful promise, however, proved tragically fragile. For these powerful men, the true antagonist was not an invading army or a cunning rival, but an insidious force brewing within their own minds the corrupting acid of unchecked authority, combined with deep-seated psychological vulnerabilities. This was the source of their internal poison. An internal poison that would soon clash violently with the world around them. For Nero, the root of his descent lay in a narcissistic hunger for adulation, amplified by the intoxicating lure of absolute power. He was an emperor who yearned to be an artist, a performer of unprecedented grandeur. This was not a healthy ambition. It was a desperate, all-consuming need for validation that transcended the boundaries of artistic expression. The Roman Senate, the traditional bulwark against imperial overreach, had long since been emasculated by successive emperors. Its members, once formidable figures, were now reduced to sycophantic yes-men, eager to appease their unpredictable sovereign. This lack of genuine checks and balances, coupled with Nero's inherent self-absorption, created a vacuum where his artistic fantasies could metastasize into tyrannical reality. When senators were forced to endure his 8-hour poetry recitals, with guards at the exits to prevent escape, it wasn't merely an inconvenience. It was a psychological assault, a deliberate subjugation of their dignity. The emperor's artistic ego, unconstrained by any moral compass or political opposition, began to demand an ever larger canvas, a more dramatic spectacle. The empire itself became his personal stage, its resources and its people merely props in his self-aggrandizing drama. His true conflict was with any reality that dared to contradict his artistic vision. Any individual who did not marvel at his supposed genius, and in Rome, where emperors were gods, who would dare to contradict a god? Elagabalus presented a different, yet equally disturbing, source of internal conflict. His was a soul steeped in fervent religious zeal, but one that interpreted divinity through a lens of profound personal and sexual experimentation. Thrust onto the throne as a mere boy, he brought with him the cult of Elagabal, a sun god from his Syrian homeland, and sought to impose its esoteric rituals upon the deeply traditional Roman state. The senators and patricians, guardians of ancient Roman rites and decorum, viewed his practices with a mixture of horror and revulsion. For them, his flamboyant rituals, dancing in silk robes, wearing cosmetics, and even self-castration in religious ecstasy, were not acts of piety, but abominations, a grotesque assault on everything sacred. The source of the conflict here was a clash of cultures, magnified by absolute power. Elagabalus believed himself a living conduit to the divine, his every eccentric act justified by spiritual conviction. His desires, whether religious or sexual, were not to be questioned, for they were so, in his mind, dictated by the gods themselves. The tension in Rome was palpable. It was the suffocating silence before a storm, as the ancient foundations of their society groaned under the weight of a young emperor's unbridled fanaticism. The traditional Roman values, already fragile from decades of imperial instability, now faced an existential threat from within the very palace walls, driven by a boy king convinced of his own divine mandate. Caligula's descent into madness, however, was perhaps the most chilling, for it stemmed from a rapid and inexplicable psychological deterioration. After his initial benevolent acts, a grave illness struck him in 37 AD. Some historians speculate it was temporal lobe epilepsy. Others suggest poisoning. But the specific cause matters less than the terrifying outcome, the emergence of a man utterly convinced of his own divinity. A living God who believed he was beyond human judgment or constraint. His antagonist was the very concept of human limitation, any whisper of mortality or weakness. The Roman Senate, initially hopeful, now found themselves facing a ruler whose very eyes gleamed with an unsettling, otherworldly light. His early conversations with statues, his arguments with Jupiter, were dismissed as eccentricities. But soon, these delusions began to bleed into his public actions. The transition was subtle at first, a chilling undercurrent of unpredictability that slowly swelled into a tidal wave of terror. The Roman people, who had celebrated his ascension, now watched with growing dread as their emperor, once so promising, began to embody the very nightmares they thought they had escaped. The tension was not just political, it was existential. They had traded one form of tyranny for a far more chaotic and unpredictable horror. A reign dictated by the fractured whims of a god king whose true desires were unknowable and terrifyingly boundless. The stage was set, not for a grand performance, but for a series of macabre acts, each more horrifying than the last. The simmering anxieties and hidden psychoses of these rulers inevitably found their devastating release in a pivotal, irreversible event. A moment when the last vestiges of conventional humanity seemed to evaporate under the unforgiving heat of absolute power. These were the true points of no return, leaving a lasting scar on the fabric of history and forever altering the lives of those caught in their orbit. For Nero, that moment arrived with the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. While historical sources fiercely debate whether he personally ignited the inferno, his reaction was unequivocally the chilling culmination of his artistic megalomania. As flames devoured the ancient city for 6 days and 7 nights, consuming half of Rome in a ravenous blaze, Nero did not rush to organize relief efforts or console his terrified populace. Instead, he commandeered a private stage, donned theatrical costume, and, with chilling satisfaction, performed his own composition. The Sack of Troy. His voice, it is said, cracked with dramatic fervor as he serenaded the screams of the dying, his plump fingers dancing across the lyre strings while real human tragedy unfolded beneath his gaze. This was not a ruler witnessing a catastrophe. It was an artist, mesmerized by his masterpiece, seeing beauty in the destruction of a million souls. The screams echoing from the streets below became his macabre symphony. the burning homes, his grand stage lights. When the last embers glowed, Nero used the cleared land not for rebuilding the city for its people, but to construct his golden house, a sprawling palace so vast it covered 300 acres of central Rome, complete with an artificial lake and a 120-foot bronze statue of himself. The fire was his ultimate performance, cementing his legacy not as a leader, but as a deranged impresario, utterly divorced from the human cost of his art. For the citizens of Rome, the emperor they knew was gone, replaced by a monstrous artist whose canvas was their suffering. Elagabalus's decisive break with Roman tradition came through his scandalous public marriages and his attempts to transform the very fabric of Roman religion. His obsession with gender and sexuality reached a fever pitch, culminating in acts that horrified even the most jaded Roman elite. He appeared in public wearing women's clothing, complete with makeup and jewelry, reportedly offering vast sums to physicians who could surgically transform him into a woman. But the most jarring displays involved his marriages. He wed multiple wives and husbands, sometimes simultaneously, blending Roman and Syrian customs in ceremonies that defied all decorum. His notorious marriage to Heracles, a former slave and chariot driver, saw Elagabalus openly refer to Heracles as his husband, while he himself assumed the role of wife, even wearing women's clothing during their private moments. Court observers recoiled as the emperor meticulously painted his eyes with cosmetics and removed his body hair, presenting himself as feminine as possible. This was more than just personal preference. It was a deliberate, blasphemous challenge to Rome's patriarchal and religious order. He transformed the sacred rituals of Rome into performances of Eastern mysticism, effectively mocking the very foundations of their society. The outrage was not merely moral. It was a realization that their emperor was systematically dismantling their world, one bizarre ritual at a time. The die was cast. Rome's ancient traditions were now directly at odds with the unbridled desires of its boy emperor. For Caligula, the definitive descent into irreversible madness, beyond mere eccentricity, occurred when his delusions of divinity began to dictate his interactions with the world. His conversations with statues of Jupiter, once whispered about by palace servants, escalated to violent arguments, culminating in him covering the statue's head with cloth during thunderstorms, convinced Jupiter was trying to frighten him. But the true horror emerged in his treatment of his subjects and, most famously, his horse. He forced senators, men of advanced age and high status, to run alongside his chariot for miles, laughing as they collapsed from exhaustion. He made elderly nobles fight in gladiatorial contests, reveling in their struggle. The dining hall, usually a place of convivial feasting, became a chamber of dread when he abruptly burst into laughter, declaring, "I just realized I could have you all killed with a single word." The laughter died, leaving a chilling silence. His most infamous act, however, concerned his horse, Incitatus. Caligula built the animal, a marble stable with an ivory manger and purple blankets, appointing it a priest and allegedly planning to make it a consul, one of Rome's highest offices. Dinner guests were required to speak to Incitatus with the same respect they showed the emperor, while the horse ate from golden bowls and drank wine from jeweled goblets. Even as senators' families starved from Caligula's excessive taxation. These weren't just eccentricities, they were deliberate acts of humiliation and power, designed to dismantle the very concept of Roman dignity and elevate his own distorted reality. For Rome, the promise of a golden age had dissolved into a living nightmare, ruled by a god king whose every whim was absolute, terrifying, and utterly divorced from human reason. The stage was now set for chaos, and the lives of all Romans were forever changed, bound by the terrifying, unpredictable will of their mad emperor. The echoes of Rome's burning, the whispers of unnatural unions, and the chilling pronouncements of a self-proclaimed god king reverberated through the ancient world, heralding a new, terrifying chapter in the annals of absolute power. What began as a personal descent into madness for Nero, Elagabalus, and Caligula soon cast a long, creeping shadow across their empires. But the tapestry of history is vast, and the tendrils of psychological corruption were weaving themselves into the fabric of other nascent powers, far beyond the Mediterranean sun. Across the vast, wind-swept steppes of Central Asia, a figure named Temujin, who would later be known as Genghis Khan, began to forge an empire not just through military might, but through an unprecedented mastery of psychological warfare. His initial reaction to the brutal, chaotic world he inhabited was one of ruthless pragmatism, total submission, or total destruction. Born around 1162 AD into a fragmented tribal society marked by endless feuds and betrayals, Temujin learned early that survival was predicated on an unwavering will and an absolute command over fear. He observed the futility of conventional warfare against entrenched enemies. The real battle was for the minds of his adversaries. His response to the constant threat of rival tribes was to perfect the art of terror, using it as a weapon even before the first arrow flew. This wasn't merely about killing. It was about breaking the enemy's spirit, about implanting a seed of dread so profound that resistance became unthinkable. His early campaigns, meticulously planned and executed, served as chilling demonstrations of what awaited those who dared to defy him. Towns were razed, populations slaughtered indiscriminately, not always out of pure bloodlust, but as calculated messages. The grim tales, embellished with each retelling, would precede his armies by hundreds of miles, causing entire cities to empty at the mere rumor of his approach. The psychological impact was immense, turning potential battlefields into ghost towns, their garrisons demoralized before they ever faced a Mongol warrior. He was building an empire on the bedrock of fear, a chilling monument to the efficacy of absolute, unwavering cruelty. Further west, nestled in the foreboding Carpathian Mountains of Wallachia, a different kind of terror was brewing. Vlad III Dracula, born around 1431 AD, responded to the trauma of his youth, spent as a hostage in the brutal Ottoman court, with a singular, chilling resolve to become the embodiment of fear itself. He had witnessed the Ottomans' use of torture and execution as tools of statecraft, absorbing their lessons with a cold, calculating intellect. When he finally seized the throne of Wallachia in 1456 AD, his initial actions were swift and brutal, aimed at consolidating power and eliminating dissent. But Vlad's true genius, his terrifying innovation, lay in transforming execution into a macabre art form impalement. It wasn't merely a method of killing. It was a psychological weapon designed to paralyze his enemies and instill absolute obedience in his subjects. Victims were stripped naked, then forced onto sharpened stakes, carefully positioned to prolong suffering for hours or even days. These stakes, once raised vertically, allowed gravity to slowly drive the wood through the victim's body, creating a living, agonizing monument to Vlad's power. This was his answer to a world defined by constant threat and betrayal. He was not just a prince, he was an executioner, an artist of pain, painting the landscape with human suffering to send an unmistakable message. His every act was a calculated performance, a grand display of his iron will. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, in the glittering capital of Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma II, the ninth Aztec emperor, responded to the cosmic anxieties of his civilization with a profound and escalating devotion to human sacrifice. Born around 1466 AD, Moctezuma inherited an empire built on a brutal, yet deeply religious, foundation. His reaction to the world's perceived instability, the fear of divine wrath, the need for bountiful harvests, the endless cycles of creation and destruction, was to immerse himself in ritualistic precision and ceremonial brutality. His daily routine began before dawn with elaborate bloodletting, piercing his ears, tongue, and genitals with obsidian blades, collecting the sacred fluid as offerings. He believed these acts, and the larger sacrifices performed by his priests, were essential for cosmic balance, for ensuring the sun's rising and the empire's prosperity. This was not a king indulging in personal sadism, but a spiritual leader deeply committed to what he believed was his divine duty. His initial response to his overwhelming responsibilities was to double down on the very practices that defined Aztec power: conquest for captives and sacrifice for the gods. The cries of the sacrificed, the scent of blood mingling with incense, became a regular, accepted part of life in the magnificent city, a constant reminder of the emperor's profound and terrifying communion with the divine. As the initial shocks reverberated, the internal conflicts of these monarchs intensified, driving them towards ever more extreme and disturbing expressions of their absolute power. The psychological burdens grew heavier, twisting their minds and turning their courts into stages for their escalating madness. For Ivan IV, soon to be known as Ivan the Terrible, the burden of a fractured childhood blossomed into full-blown paranoia and systematic cruelty. Born in 1530 AD, Ivan became Grand Prince of Moscow at age 3, a mere pawn among the grasping boyar nobles who served as his regents. These powerful men alternately coddled and abused him, teaching him early that cruelty was the ultimate language of power. His reaction to this volatile environment was to internalize their lessons, but with a terrifying twist. His initial response to perceived threats, which multiplied with his growing paranoia, was to lash out with unimaginable ferocity. He found solace not in human connection, but in a bizarre fusion of fervent religious ritual and unbridled violence. He would spend hours in prayer, prostrating himself before icons until his forehead bled, memorizing vast portions of religious texts, yet in the same breath, he would authorize brutal executions. His increasingly complex mind, burdened by the absolute power he now wielded, saw treachery everywhere. The political landscape of Russia, already volatile, became a minefield of suspicion, where a careless word could lead to excruciating torture and death. The Tsar's reign began to spiral into a relentless cycle of purges and terror, each act of brutality reinforcing his delusion that he was cleansing Russia of its enemies, divinely sanctioned in his righteous fury, across the Mediterranean, in the suffocating luxury of the Ottoman palace. Ibrahim I grappled with the devastating psychological aftereffects of his upbringing in the cage, a gilded prison where potential heirs were confined to prevent them from challenging the reigning sultan for 22 years from his childhood. Ibrahim lived in this isolation, his only companions eunuchs and concubines, his only entertainment books and musical instruments. When he became sultan in 1640 AD, following his brother Murad IV's death, he emerged utterly unprepared for the complexities of rule, his mind confusing fantasy with reality, pleasure with power. His initial reaction to freedom and absolute power was an insatiable, pathological sexual obsession. He immediately demanded an entirely new harem, convinced the previous concubines were contaminated by his brother. Agents scoured the empire to collect thousands of women, and Ibrahim would spend entire days examining them naked, meticulously ranking them, developing specific fetishes that grew increasingly bizarre. At one point, fixating on overweight women, whom he dubbed sugar cubes. His daily routine revolved entirely around sexual gratification, often lasting 12 hours, leaving him in a state of constant exhaustion. The weight of his duties as sultan, combined with his deep-seated psychological trauma, manifested as an escalating series of demands and cruelties. His court became a world shaped by his capricious sexual appetites, where women were mere objects to be collected, measured, and discarded at whim. The empire itself began to groan under the weight of his lavish spending on the harem, as his soldiers went unpaid and his subjects starved. Meanwhile, on the grand stage of England, Henry VIII, once a golden prince, faced an escalating crisis of succession that would twist his once charismatic personality into a tyrannical obsession. Born in 1491 AD, Henry began his reign as a handsome, athletic, and beloved monarch. His initial response to the lack of a male heir from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was a desperate, all-consuming need for a legitimate son to secure the Tudor dynasty. This wasn't merely a political necessity. It became a personal torment, a psychological burden that consumed his every thought. His inability to produce a male heir ignited a relentless quest for a new wife, culminating in his dramatic break with the Catholic Church in 1534 AD. This act, driven by sexual frustration and a desperate need for a male heir, irrevocably changed England. He declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, systematically destroying monasteries and seizing their immense wealth. But the real escalation lay in his treatment of those who opposed his will. His once jovial nature was slowly corroded by paranoia and a ruthless determination. Any dissent, any challenge to his authority, particularly concerning his marriages, was met with swift and brutal reprisal. The burden of his own desires, unfulfilled and magnified by absolute power, pushed him to increasingly extreme measures, transforming a king renowned for his charm into a monarch infamous for his cruelty. The Tower of London, once a royal residence, slowly transformed into his private, terrifying divorce court. The escalating paranoia and unbridled desires of these rulers inevitably led to a shocking event, a catastrophic failure, or a chilling revelation that exposed the true, terrifying extent of their power and their own unraveling minds. It was a moment when the world around them, and sometimes even they themselves, realized the problem was far greater, far more monstrous than previously imagined. For Genghis Khan, the true horror of his psychological warfare was brutally unveiled during the siege of Kaffa in 1347 AD. While he had pioneered the use of terror, his successors fully embraced its most grotesque manifestation. The Mongol forces, during their relentless push westward, encountered a formidable obstacle in the fortified city of Kaffa. Unable to breach its walls conventionally, they resorted to a method that would shock even the hardened medieval world. They began to catapult plague-infected corpses over the city walls. This wasn't just a military tactic. It was a profound violation of natural law, an unholy weaponization of death itself. The sight of rotting, disease-ridden bodies arcing through the air, crashing down within the city, must have been a sickening spectacle, a tangible manifestation of a monstrous will. The stench, the visual horror, and the swift, agonizing death that followed for thousands confirmed to the besieged that their enemy was not just an army, but an embodiment of pestilence, an unholy force. This act, whether a direct order from the dying Khan or a terrible inheritance from his successors, confirmed the chilling depth of his philosophy. Total destruction knew no bounds. Not even the sanctity of life or the horror of biological contagion. The world learned, in the most horrifying way possible, that Genghis Khan's ambition had spawned a terror that could transcend even death. Back in Wallachia, Vlad the Impaler orchestrated his most infamous display, a grotesque masterpiece that seared his legend into the very soul of Europe. In 1459 AD, outside the city of Targovishte, he created a forest of stakes that stretched for miles. Over 20,000 Ottoman prisoners, captured during his relentless campaigns, were impaled, their bodies arranged meticulously by height and social status, slowly succumbed to agonizing death under the open sky. But the true, stomach-churning revelation came when Vlad positioned his own dining table directly in the center of this human garden. He hosted diplomatic meetings there, forcing Ottoman envoys to negotiate while surrounded by the sounds of moaning victims and the putrid stench of death. The diplomats reported that the horror was so profound, the smell so overwhelming, that negotiation was utterly impossible. This wasn't a failure for Vlad, it was his chilling triumph. He understood that the terror he inspired was a weapon more potent than any sword. The absolute inhumanity of the scene, the casual cruelty of a ruler dining amidst the dying, was a stark, undeniable truth. Vlad was not merely a cruel man. He was a master of psychological torture, a strategist of dread. He had transcended conventional warfare to wage a war on the human spirit itself, and in doing so, he revealed the terrifying depths to which a mind, twisted by trauma and absolute power, could descend. And in the heart of the Aztec Empire, Moctezuma sings profound, yet ultimately tragic. Failure was revealed not by an external enemy, but by his own unshakable religious delusion in the face of the Spanish conquistadors. When Hernán Cortés arrived in 1519 AD, Moctezuma believed him to be the returning god Quetzalcoatl, as predicted by Aztec prophecy. His advisors warned of the stranger's intentions, their greed for gold, and their aggressive posture. But Moctezuma, so utterly consumed by his own spiritual interpretations and visions, dismissed these warnings as mere human folly. He welcomed the Spanish with elaborate ceremonies, showering them with blood and precious stones, believing he was fulfilling a divine mandate. He willingly became a prisoner in his own palace, his spiritual certainty blinding him to the obvious, brutal threat. This was a king whose greatest strength, his unwavering faith, became his fatal flaw. His failure was not military. It was a profound spiritual misjudgment, an inability to adapt to a reality that defies his prophecies. The horrifying truth that slowly dawned on the Aztec elite was that their emperor, who claimed to speak with gods, was utterly incapable of recognizing human treachery when it stood before him, dressed in steel and demanding his gold. The meticulously ordered world of Tenochtitlan, built on centuries of ritual and belief, was now threatened not by cosmic imbalance, but by the very human ambition and ruthlessness of a foreign power, unchecked by an emperor lost in his own divine dreams. The magnificent capital, once a symbol of cosmic order, now teetered on the brink of an unimaginable downfall, orchestrated by a faith that offered no defense against the cold steel of conquest. The subtle shifts in a ruler's mind, once a whisper, now crescendoed into a roar, unleashing a wave of irreversible decisions and public spectacles. For Genghis Khan, his legacy of total war peaked when his successors, at the siege of Kaffa in 1347 AD, horrifyingly catapulted plague-infected corpses over city walls, weaponizing death itself in Wallachia. Vlad the Impaler's chilling mastery of terror was cemented in 1459 AD, when he created a forest of stakes of 20,000 impaled victims outside Targoviste, then famously dined amidst the dying. A grotesque tableau of absolute power. In the Aztec Empire, Moctezuma II's tragic turning point came with Hernán Cortés's arrival in 1519 AD. His religious delusion led him to welcome the conquistadors as returning gods, effectively sacrificing his empire for prophecy. For Ivan the Terrible, his ultimate descent was the horrifying murder of his own son, Ivan Ivanovich, in 1581 AD, during a fit of uncontrollable rage, leaving Russia without a clear heir, and its czar isolated by his own monstrous act. The irreversible decisions of these monarchs plunged their realms into escalating danger. After Rome's Great Fire, Nero's self-serving reconstruction of his golden house amidst public devastation fueled widespread discontent and serious conspiracies. Elagabalus's bizarre religious rituals and public sexual acts, including marrying a former slave and operating an imperial brothel, utterly alienated Rome's Praetorian Guard and elite, inciting the plots that would soon end his reign. Caligula's profound delusions of divinity resulted in escalating sadistic whims, forcing senators to run alongside his chariot, making elderly nobles fight, and famously attempting to appoint his horse, Incitatus, as consul, creating a pervasive climate of fear. On the European continent, Louis XIV's obsession with ceremony turned Versailles into a gilded cage, where nobles were trapped in endless rituals, subtly controlling them while masking the kingdom's spiraling debt and growing societal resentment. Across the Channel, Henry VIII's desperate quest for a male heir drove his break with Rome, leading to serial marriages and ruthless purges. His once charismatic self devolved into a physically decaying, paranoid tyrant, making the Tower of London a constant symbol of dread. In the Ottoman Empire, Ibrahim Fairytale's extreme sexual obsession culminated in the horrifying drowning of his entire harem, nearly 300 women, due to baseless infidelity suspicions, bankrupting the empire and pushing the Janissaries to the brink of rebellion. The escalating madness often led these rulers to profound isolation, leaving them alone amidst their grand, yet empty, domains. For Charles VI of France, Charles the Mad, his belief that he was made of glass led to extreme self-neglect and withdrawal, leaving France to bleed into civil war. Radu the Handsome, Vlad's brother, found his nadir in complete submission to the Ottomans, converting to Islam and using his charm as a political tool, becoming a culturally lost prince. In the Fatimid Caliphate, Al-Hakim bi-Amr Allah's bizarre prohibitions on daily life and alternating persecutions, driven by his divine claims, ultimately alienated his subjects and culminated in his mysterious, isolating disappearance from Afghanistan. Ahmad Shah Durrani's unique obsession with his magnificent beard and conversing with collections of severed heads for military advice cemented his isolated, superstitious worldview. Akbar the Great, despite his tolerance, found a unique philosophical solitude in creating his syncretic Din-i-Ilahi, placing him above traditional faiths and isolating him intellectually. David Vorst of Scotland, though canonized, pushed his kingdom to financial ruin through extreme monastic endowments, his devout zeal leaving his successors with a weakened realm. Finally, Rudolph II of the Holy Roman Empire sank into profound isolation, withdrawing into his alchemical and occult pursuits while his empire crumbled, ultimately forced to abdicate, alone in his world of fantastical experiments. The final act arrived for these rulers, not as a quiet fade, but as a violent crescendo. For Nero, rebellion spread, forcing him to a desperate end in 68 AD. He chose suicide, famously lamenting, "What an artist dies in me, Elagabalus's reign, plagued by bizarre excesses," met its abrupt end in 222 AD when the Praetorian Guard, disgusted, assassinated the 18-year-old emperor. Caligula's sadistic rule culminated in 41 AD, when a humiliated officer, Cassius Caria, led a conspiracy, ambushing and stabbing him 30 times, ensuring his line ended with his murdered wife and daughter. Moctezuma II's unwavering faith proved his undoing in 1520 AD, as he faced not gods but cunning conquerors, imprisoned by Cortés. He died by his own people's stones or Spanish hands, his spiritual delusion crumbling his empire. Ivan the Terrible's long, bloody reign concluded quietly in 1584 AD while playing chess. A possible stroke or poison, ending the life of a czar consumed by paranoia and rage. Finally, Ibrahim the Farid's incompetence and debauchery sparked a Janissary revolt in 1648 AD, dragged from his harem. He was swiftly strangled with a silk cord, his mother's permission sealing his fate. As the dust settled, the devastating consequences of these reigns became clear. After Nero's death, Rome saw a brief, failed attempt at a republic, quickly crushed as Claudius ascended, reinforcing the cycle of tyranny. Elagabalus's body was dragged through Rome and thrown into the Tiber, his name erased from records via damnatio memoriae. Yet his bizarre legend endured. Caligula's murder similarly led to Claudius's quick ascension, crushing any fleeting dream of a restored republic. Moctezuma II's demise marked the tragic, rapid fall of the Aztec Empire, his religious obsessions unable to prevent conquest. Ivan the Terrible's death plunged Russia into the time of troubles, a brutal succession crisis born from his paranoid purges. Ibrahim I's execution left the Ottoman Empire financially drained and shamed, though it survived, forever wary of unchecked power. Not all reigns ended in violence, yet their conclusions equally illuminated power's corrosive nature. Charles VI died mentally broken in 1422 AD, leaving France ravaged by civil war, a stark reminder that even royal blood offered no immunity from the mind's torments. Radu, the handsome's ambiguous end in 1475 AD, possibly poisoned, underscored a life caught between Ottoman submission and cultural betrayal, dying a prince without a clear identity. Al-Hakim Biamr. Allah's mysterious disappearance in 1021. His body never found, symbolized a life of unpredictable rule and lasting religious delusion. Ahmad Shah Durrani, even in death in 1772 AD, planned for his severed head to advise his successors, his empire, built on peculiar genius, soon collapsed. Akbar the Great, though enlightened, faced intellectual solitude, creating his universal Din-e-Ilahi, a legacy of tolerance that nonetheless highlighted his unique philosophical isolation. David I of Scotland, a canonized saint, nearly bankrupted his kingdom in 1153 AD with extreme piety, showing divine devotion could come at a steep worldly cost. Finally, Rudolph II died in 1612 of AD amidst failed alchemical experiments, his political neglect leaving an empire ravaged by war, a symbol of a mind lost in fantastical delusion. These kings, for all their grotesque habits, remind us of a terrifying truth: absolute power, unrestrained, twists the human spirit. The tools of control may evolve, from impalement stakes to digital manipulation. But the fundamental dynamic persists. These weren't monsters from folklore, but human beings whose frailties, magnified by boundless authority, became the nightmares of their age. The line between ruler and monster, a chilling whisper from history, remains etched in the fleeting sand of circumstance, easily erased by unchecked ambition. They simply forgot they were human, and so we close the book on these 15 extraordinary, often terrifying, reigns, their stories, echoing across centuries, serve as a stark, chilling reminder absolute power, unfettered by wisdom or empathy, is not merely corrupting. It is a corrosive acid that dissolves the very essence of humanity. These were not mythical beasts, but men, born with the same capacities for good and ill as any of us, yet transformed into living nightmares by the intoxicating, boundless reach of their authority. The lessons are clear. The line between ruler and monster is often far thinner than we dare to imagine, easily blurred by ambition and unchecked control. What do you think is the most terrifying truth revealed by these dark chapters of history? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We're eager to hear your perspectives on the insidious nature of power. If delving into the hidden truths and psychological depths of history fascinates you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of our future journeys into the past. And while you wait for our next exploration, consider watching our video on the dark secrets of ancient dynasties for another deep dive into royal intrigue and madness.